It looks like we're keeping track, and it looks like we've got a critical mass of those that have registered, that have actually logged on, but we'll probably have a few people pop on in the next few minutes. We've structured today's webinar in two chunks. There's a morning session and an afternoon session. We did a dry run of these yesterday, and they generally took a little bit less time than we have budgeted for the agenda, but of course that was without all of your questions, so we think the agenda is probably a good approximation of the time. The morning session is pertaining to Senate Bill 5491 and our work on the educational system health indicators. Greg Lobdell will be walking us through some of the analytical work that has taken place thus far and the conversations we have had with members of the State Board of Education. That report is due to the legislature on December 1st, correct, Greg?
Yep.
And the November State Board of Education meeting, I believe it's the 14th and 15th, will be a critical meeting of the board as well as representatives from the other agencies that are in the bill to try to coalesce around how to handle this report and the goals in it. The afternoon session pertains to Senate Bill 5329. That has two chunks of work in it. The rule language that is proposed for laying out the required action district level 2 process, and also the guiding principles that the State Board of Education is tasked with developing and adopting in rule. But this morning is on the goals. I'm going to turn it over to Linda and Sarah to talk about webinar logistics, and then we'll get right to it.
Okay, well, the webinar we hope will be a good format for collecting some brief responses from you, but it is a bit constraining as well. So please don't feel constrained. If you want to give us feedback on anything, even if we don't ask the question, please email us or call us. We also will be doing a follow-up survey after the webinar to so you'll have a chance to give us feedback on anything you may have missed on today. The main ways to give us feedback during the webinar will be just to type in comments in the questions and chat box. At the very end of the webinar, we will unmute the phones so that people can give a verbal comment or question. If you have questions at any time, type them in. We'll be keeping track of the questions, and there'll be sort of natural places in the presentation to stop where we can answer some questions. Okay.
And to facilitate the unmuting at the end, it would be great if you want to speak during that time. If you type into your question chat box, please call on me. And then when we unmute it, we will call on the people who have asked to speak. And that way we don't have a bunch of people trying to talk at the same time.
Okay, thank you for that. I think we're set and ready to go. Greg, would you take us through the material?
Great, thanks Ben and Linda and Sarah. As we get going here today, we're going to be moving through kind of the first phase of the work on the 5491 educational health indicators and walking through some of the early work and feedback that's been received thus far. I want to also just encourage people to use the chat window to note comments and suggestions. And if after the webinar, if you still have additional comments that you want to add, as Linda mentioned, make sure that those get emailed to Linda or myself, greg@effectiveness.org, and we'll make sure that gets put into the kind of collective thinking around this work. Today, what we're doing is basically asking each of the AAW members to provide some specific feedback on a couple areas. The pre-read memo that was sent out to each of you has some specific sections in it, and we'll have specific points of pause during the next few minutes where we'll actually be adding a bit of color commentary to the conversation and then watching your feedback as you type it in, your comments, your suggestions. But the three pieces we're really asking for specific feedback. One are the overall guiding principles. These are some high-level aspects that are kind of guiding the work around the 5491 indicators. And then the statement of goal targets, which is, again, a somewhat high-level view of what is our strategy as we set the goals. And then we'll be walking through some of the specific work that's going on around setting specific targets. So basically taking the goal targets and then applying those to the 6 very specific indicators specified in 5491. And I'll be walking you through a couple examples of what that will look like. As we get into this work, I think it's critical that members of the AAW and others who are involved in this work understand at the beginning of the bill kind of the intent side of what was specified in Senate Bill 5491. And specifically, we were asked to establish a discrete set of statewide data points, and these were really to serve as snapshots of the overall health of the educational system, and specifically as a means for evaluating progress, and furthermore, to understand whether reform efforts and investments are making positive progress. So that legislative intent really kind of guides the approach we're taking here. One of the aspects of this is the indicators specified in 5491 are very, very specific, but there also is the language in the bill that this collaborative team will also be recommending modifications to those. And so one of the things we're also looking at is not only where are we at on the 5491 indicators, but where should we or where do we need to go as we look forward and really kind of bringing together alignment with the other systems of accountability that are either under development or in place. The slide that currently is displayed is a specific, essentially a verbatim text pull directly from 5491. I wanted the AAW members to understand just how specific the bill language is around the 6 indicators. One of the things that, as you study this, becomes somewhat clear is there's not a lot of latitude around how we interpret these 6 indicators. So they're very specific. So the percentage of students demonstrating the characteristics of entering kindergartens in all 6 of the domains in the WAKIDS inventory. Percentage of students meeting standard on 4th grade reading. Percentage of students meeting standard on 8th grade math. 4-year cohort graduation rate. Percentage of high school graduates enrolled in post-secondary education, training, or employed. And then the percentage of students enrolled in pre-college or remedial courses. The specificity of these goals has kind of been factored into our initial work as we kind of look at where are we at and where do we need to go in setting goals around these indicators. One of the things to touch on is the collaborative group that's been providing feedback on this between the state board, the AAW, and the other partners that are involved throughout the state is really to establish a process for identifying realistic and challenging system-wide performance goals. And we've kept that realistic but challenging in front of us throughout this process. There is the notion within the bill that the goal for each indicator must be updated on a biannual basis and may only be adjusted upward. And so we'll have some specific kind of details and comments on that as we move through. But I think one of the roles here is we want all of the partners involved, including the AAW, to have significant opportunity to guide these conversations and to provide feedback. At the top level, as we get into this work, the collaboration and kind of the thoughts coming out of the September State Board meeting led us to some overarching guiding principles around this work. And I've summarized these. There's more narrative around these in the memo that was the pre-read. But these 6 guiding principles have been guiding a lot of our thought and our application as we get into actually ideas around setting goals. And I wanted to take just a second to remind people what these guiding principles have been. And specifically, the state's role is important, but it's limited in some very important ways. And specifically, part of the state's role is to set those standards and for developing the tools to assess our programs and processes, and that's really the role that's being taken here as a side effect or as the consequence of 5491. As we look at this, we've been looking at various goal scenarios, and the goal is not always obvious. And I think particularly not only as we look at the application to the current very specific 6 indicators, but also to recommendations we want to make for the future, we want to consider the implications and the unintended consequences as we set goals and the measures for each of those indicators. There's a small typo on the next 2 lines. Improvement takes time and improvement takes resources. And as that text got copied over, the 3rd and 4th bullets got reproduced twice, but it's improvement takes time and improvements take resources. And we realize that we are in a time of significant change, from the impending work around Common Core and the SBAC assessments, to TPEP, to wider and more broad implementation of the Washington Kids Inventory. There's a lot of things happening in the state, and as we look at factoring that level of change into our goal setting, it's one of the things that we're reminded that this will take time. The resources are being applied as we kind of move through the implementation of McCleary. And within all of this, we have a significant perspective around alignment across the various efforts which are going on in terms of looking at indicators of educational health. And there are a number of those activities and projects underway, and trying to be aware of and bring the best thinking around all of these efforts into one aligned system is also one of the guiding principles that we've kind of kept in the back of our mind as we move forward. As I mentioned just a couple minutes ago, this first effort and the report, which is due to the legislature by December 1, is really essentially the kind of initial prototype, the beta test version, so to speak, of what we're looking at here. Because a big part of that will be to explicitly identify where are we at and the goals around the specific set 6 indicators, but also factoring in all of the comments, all of the suggestions that come in from the various partners, and being hopefully laying out a very clear roadmap of where we need to go as we move forward. So this is being thought of as a dynamic process that will evolve and get better over time. And I think that's one of the things that perhaps you could think of as, from overarching comments and suggestions standpoint, is what would you each like to see as we move forward in refining and evolving this work over the next several years. At this point, I'd like to just stop for a second, let you kind of process what you're thinking. Some of the members here in the room will be adding some comments to these conversations as well. But I'd like to give everybody an opportunity just to reflect on those guiding principles, and in the chat on the side of your screen to potentially add comments, add suggestions. We'll be watching those as they come through.
So Greg, as we're waiting for people to kind of formulate their questions, maybe I'll start off with the question, and Maria and Deb, anybody else, if they feel so inclined. But Greg, as you kind of worked through the indicators that are in the bill, specifically in the bill as you've listed here in this PowerPoint slide, what occurs to you as indicators that may be missing or indicators that might need to be modified?
That's one of the kind of preeminent questions that we're looking at. And I think as we look at the specificity of the language in the bill, particularly the 4th grade reading, 8th grade math indicators are very specific in percent of students meeting standard. And while raw performance, percent of students meeting standard, is one very critical measure to look at, when we really step back and look at achievement, these indicators build over time, and they're predictive and summative in nature in most instances. And so looking at growth is going to be, I believe, a critical element as we move forward. And if we look at even fourth grade reading, that's summative of the PK through fourth grade window, but it's also predictive. It's a leading indicator of the latter part of elementary and the move into middle school. And if there's a gap on the fourth grade reading indicator, then we want to look at the growth gap, because we would expect growth to hopefully accelerate for those in which there is a gap.
Sure.
So being very conscious of the duality that there is both a readiness gap potentially to look at and a growth gap to look at as potential measures within the overall indicators.
I would agree with that. I also want to sort of keep in mind as we're looking at proficiency and percent of students meeting standard with the upcoming changes to the Common Core and Smarter Balance. Because that will be a transition this year, and then the next school year will be a big a change for the state, and so we want to be cautious about that.
Deb, is there any reason to believe that the rebasing or the correction, whatever we call this transition from one system to another, will be different for reading and math or any of the subject areas? Or is it likely to just be kind of the same proportionally for each?
I am not aware of any information that might say how much each might change as a result of the change. I don't know of any information on that, how much it will impact one or
That'll be
the
interesting
other.
to see.
I have heard that Washington will be affected less than other states, but we won't know until we see it.
Okay, no questions as of yet, Craig. So maybe we will forge forward with the next.
We'll continue. One of the things I might suggest really quick, just so we can double check that the system is working, is if the people who are on the phone could simply type their name in the chat window so we confirm that we actually are seeing what you all are writing, we would appreciate that, just so we see this as we look forward, as we kind of watch what's going on. Can we make that window larger? We're only seeing one line and there's all these things scrolling by.
We're muted.
Oh, you should be able to hit there's a little box next to the X, and it will open it out onto your screen, and you can make it bigger once you do that.
Oh, that one right
There we
And are you seeing responses?
go. Yep. I don't want to be mute too long, guys. So
I'm not seeing them over here.
here we go. Ready?
Yep.
We're on.
Great, thank you. We are seeing comments come through. We just enlarged our window a little bit so we can see more than a few lines. And we'll be watching these as they go through and kind of bring these things back into the conversation. Several of the comments were appreciative of the fact that you were able to type in your name, so we do see all of those things. And we're going to kind of factor these comments and questions in as we kind of move forward throughout the material. So definitely keep those things coming, because as we really were planning on pausing at this point, kind of specifically to get feedback around the guiding principles. It looks like we're getting some of those coming across the screen, and we appreciate that and thank you for your thinking on that.
Greg, if I might offer another question at this point, so kind of along the same lines of analyzing these indicators and what might be modified or added, have you encountered any of these indicators where from a data perspective we've got issues and challenges right from the get-go in terms of our ability to measure it or in terms of having enough of an N or any of those particular issues?
Yeah, Ben raises a very good question, and across the 6 indicators, there are some significant challenges in terms of where we're at today and where we need to be moving forward. So even looking at just purely the current environment of the 6 indicators, Starting with indicator number one, the kindergarten readiness data out of the WA-Kids assessment. The sample from fall of 2012-13, so the 12-13 school year, last school year, was just over 20,000 students. That sample showed significant sampling bias in that it was sampled out of the state-funded full-day kindergartens. Those environments tended to be in higher need environments. And so the inherent sampling bias in baselining off of that initial 20,000 rough sample for WA-Kids is a challenge moving forward. Between now and 2018, when we get to full implementation of WA-Kids with all kindergartners in the state, that data set will become more and more representative until we're effectively at 100% with the 2018 data. So that, as a baseline, may need to be recalibrated or re-leveled as the sample kind of fills out throughout the state. Over the weekend, we took a look at the 25 largest districts in the state, and that serves about 44% of the state's children. And there are some big holes in there where there's 0 kids out of several of those districts. So that's one example. 4th grade reading and 8th grade math are perhaps right now and today the best historical data sets we have. But as Deb mentioned a few minutes ago, we have some significant challenges in 2014-15 as we roll into the SBAC assessments. Additionally, even in the 2013-14 data, those of you who are taking the pilot version of SBAC will also impact the stability of the statewide data set on MSP reading and MSP math at 4th and 8th grade. With the graduation rate indicator, that's one of the more stable ones in terms of our ability to look at that in its definition. The post-secondary college attendance and employment raises some interesting challenges. We understand the intent behind that was to really look at the percentage of students that are engaged in these areas of life. So there are some challenges in the employment data in a requirement that we're only seeing that data where we have Social Security numbers, so there are some challenges in looking at that data. But we are seeing that there are ways that we think we can mediate these changes and be smart about these changes as we move forward.
Greg, let me ask one more question, and then it looks like we do have some questions that have been sent in. One of the things that came up at the state board meeting, Greg, was a concern, which I think you were there for that part of it, a concern among the board members about the reliability of the WA-Kids data, and also an issue about what's the appropriate use of WA-Kids data, and is this the way we ought to be using WA-Kids data at a state level, and what is this really for? So do you have some thoughts about whether or not WA-Kids data is an appropriate statewide educational health indicator in that respect?
I'm hoping that Deb will also jump in perhaps on this one as well. I've had a lot of conversations over the last several weeks with the people out in the field, people in districts that have WA-Kids data, that are looking at WA-Kids data. And certainly from a design point, my understanding and my view of this tool is it was really to identify and to guide the instructional practices from the early part of the kindergarten year through the end of kindergarten year to ensure that child grew in their skills and behaviors and practices getting ready for 1st grade. That inherently puts some limitations on it because it is self-administered and self-scored. There are some inherent concerns around the reliability of the data. There are practices or some procedures that are underway to look at that. I haven't had an opportunity to dig into it really deeply.
Do we have inter-rater reliability data on WA-Kids? I mean, I really don't know that. Is that data that is collected, or?
Yeah, this is Deb. I don't know the details of it, but I do believe they do some checking for reliability.
That'll be a good thing to follow up on, because we're getting that question from a number of different sources. maybe at this point I see we've had a flood of questions here, so maybe we can read some of these off.
There's been several questions that have come in about the impact around kind of the ELL data and districts which are higher ELL. Remember that the 5491 indicators are state level indicators only and are not designed to be disaggregated at the district level. So the plan and intent with 5491 is that these are whole state views, which the only disaggregation is at the subgroup level. I think we do recognize the inherent limitations of looking at the ELL subgroup when the assessment is an English-only assessment, and particularly in elementary grades, if the student does not have English language proficiency, that inherently that subgroup will always be low.
And I should mention that at the last state board meeting, you know, the board was kind of regrouping on this issue of ELL accountability writ large, whether it pertains to 5491, the Achievement Index, or any of these, and is kind of strategizing about how to up the ante a little bit as they continue to receive resistance from the federal government, and possibly building a coalition of other states to come around a collective policy position, so that it's not just Washington saying, hey, we'd like to try an every ELL approach, but to try to leverage some cross-state influence there. So I also noticed that Kenji Hakuda is going to be at WERA this year, and Kenji Hakuda indeed wrote some of the literature upon which we relied for some of these recommendations, and that might be a good opportunity as a state to bring him on board as well. Do you want to touch on any of the policy things? See what else we got here. 2260, this question, okay, so we're going to read these anonymously, I guess. 2261 is cited as the primary vehicle for providing resources, but 2261 does not really address putting more resources into high needs areas. So I think there's an equity funding issue that is not really addressed. It's an interesting issue. I suppose that is true on some level. I kind of have to process that a little bit longer. I think in the phasing in of 2261, there's definitely a priority to high poverty schools, but indeed at the end point, other than the LAP program, which 2261 doesn't necessarily make any specific promise of, that's a true statement. So I don't really have an answer for that particular question, but it's a good one. It really comes down to what is the ultimate, at full implementation, what is our ultimate assumption about the differential needs of high poverty schools in relationship to other schools? And that's a good question. Next question, please explain how K-12 districts have any control to impact the skill level of entering kindergartners when some communities in our state have little or no support for pre-K programs, especially when applied to high poverty, high ELL communities. That's absolutely correct. I don't think they do have any control over it. And that raises an important point about these indicators. I think that there are some of these 5491 indicators that are more under the direct purview of schools than others. And in the case of WA Kids, I don't think, other than building professional development opportunities with community providers, I don't think there is a tremendous amount that schools can be held accountable for in terms of the readiness of kids that show up at their doorstep. And that is not the intent. It's certainly not our intent. And I think the way I think about these indicators is that they're supposed to drive policy, and if we can demonstrate that kindergarten readiness, or lack thereof in certain communities, is a huge determinant or obstacle to our achieving our system goals, that creates a platform for advocacy with the legislature to say, if we're, for example, really serious about closing the achievement gap, a lot of the achievement gap has already transpired or been created before students show up to kindergarten, and we need to recognize that and put our money where our mouth is, so to speak. So, Linda, you want to read the next one?
Sure. Concerning the percentage of students enrolled in pre-college and remedial course, the SBCTC report includes data on recent high school graduates within the previous 3 years. Perhaps this should be specifically stated in the indicator to exclude older returning adult students in pre-college courses.
That's a really good point. Yeah. So the comment is that the data that we have is students within 3 years. Is that how I understand that comment? I think it is. I think the broader point here is we definitely do want to make a distinction between students who require remediation after, they come back to school when they're 45, for example, and one would almost expect a certain amount of learning loss there versus a kid who moves on to a community college the next year. That's a totally different situation. We wouldn't want to conflate those two pieces of data. So I think I'm agreeing with this person's comment.
And I think these are the kind of comments that allow us to tighten up the definition of the indicators and to be really clear in the communications around the indicators, and then some type of kind of technical white paper that goes really into the gory detail of how the indicators were gathered. These are the kind of comments which we'll track and basically build our library of, so we ensure that these things kind of are factored into how we communicate and kind of create this initial report.
Yes. And I think the comment earlier is a very good comment about, WA Kids and the relationship of school accountability to WA Kids is a good tie-in to a comment you were making earlier about indicators we might add to 5491, because as you and I have discussed, when we think about the achievement gap, it seems to me that there are at least two very discrete ways of thinking about the achievement gap. There's the gap that exists when kids show up to kindergarten, that it's already been created before they enter the K-12 system. And then there is the extent of the gap that exacerbates as students go through the system. So there's a readiness gap, and there is a growth gap within K-12. And it might be interesting to have separate indicators for those two different elements, because including WA Kids as an indicator sheds light on one of those two aspects in a way that we typically don't think about. Maria.
This is Maria Flores. Adding to that, and kind of piggybacking on what Greg said, so we have schools where, regardless of where the kids come in and whether they had formal pre-K or not, they are able to capture that kid and grow them faster, and that's kind of what Ben is saying as well. I wouldn't see the WA Kids as being, it's not an accountability measure exactly, it is that snapshot, and if we could say, the only problem with WA Kids is it's given once. We'd see the beginning of the year and the end of the year in kindergarten, and we wouldn't see first grade, second grade, because they're developmentally appropriate to kindergarten. But being able to capture which schools grow them faster in first grade, in second grade, and basically compensate for the different places that students come from is a totally important thing that we'd want to focus on.
Absolutely.
Schools that don't target the students who have no formal pre-K and then let the gap persist and grow wider, we'd also want to be able to capture that. But the thing is, in these metrics, we wouldn't catch that till fourth grade.
So, Greg, I see there's more comments, but I'm thinking maybe for reasons of pacing, maybe we can go through the next couple indicators and then loop back.
Yes, that's a good point. I will touch on one question that's come up a couple times from people about where will the indicators be displayed and reported. We're still working on the details, and that will be driven by Ben and the state board team. But these will be kind of driven by the state board, and then there will be kind of the appropriate communications that support how both the technical side and the high-level side around these.
And my vision, if I can come together with the necessary resources, is to have an integrated tool where the OSPI report card, the index, and the statewide indicators are aligned in a useful online tool. It seems as if we've got a little bit of data silo going on right now, and it would be good if we kind of built one integrated piece. But that's going to take some time and some money. So.
There are several of the other questions where I'm actually going to come back to as we move through. Some of these are about kind of phasing and timelines, and so we'll kind of touch on those as we look at these. But to be clear, because the questions come up a couple times, the 5491 indicators are not being designed to be disaggregated at the district level. These are essentially the display or the visibility of these is the state level as indicators of educational health, and then at the subgroup level, but not disaggregated to the district level.
And some of these questions are really good. We may not have time to address them right now, but we have a recording of the webinar, so we can circle back around to some of these as well.
Okay. We are trying to read and process at the same time here. Here's a comment about, Ben, thanks for your comments about getting serious about closing the achievement gap by putting resources in pre-K and differentiating resources for highly impacted schools. However, we need to make these changes without punishing schools, teachers, and communities in which they learn and live by putting them on lists. Indeed. I mean, I think that I think there's some anxiety about WA Kids as a statewide indicator. For whatever it's worth, I come at it from the opposite end in the sense that I'm anxious for it to be an indicator because I think it puts the legislature in the spot of saying, okay, if you are really serious, if you're going to set a goal to close the achievement gap, and we are showing you data every year that says that a significant part of that achievement gap is attributable to the early years of life, there's only two ways to close that gap. You can either have enormous growth that differentiates by subgroup in the K-12 system, or you have to invest in early childhood education. So I understand that there's some anxiety about thinking of this as an accountability mechanism at the school and district level. I do not at all think of it that way. I think of it as more of an accountability mechanism for the legislature. It has a way of saying, do you or don't you have the courage of your convictions about this issue? And if you do, funding early learning is an essential part. What else do we got here, Greg? Ben, isn't part of the point of these indicators isn't part of the point of these educational indicators to measure the entire system, pre-K through college, not just K-12 health? Indeed it is. And there are at least two of these indicators that are outside the bounds of K-12, and really, in that sense, would be going to rely more heavily on our partners at Student Achievement Council, SBCTC, at Dell. But WA Kids is certainly an example of that, although it's given in K, but it's really reflecting growth and learning occurring before that. The last indicator, and Greg, I may not be able to come up with this verbatim, but the percentage of post-secondary attainment and employment, I believe it is, in the first and fourth quarters, was it? Second and fourth quarters, is also something that is arguably an essential look at the health of what is happening to our kids when they leave the K-12 system. But of course, it's logistically it's something that happens outside of the system, and that, as I recall, was one of the indicators for which we have data challenges. If there is not district or school level indicators, how will the information be useful for districts and schools? That is, districts and schools will have their information, but it won't be released by the state, or there won't be disaggregated data. That's a good question, and it really, one of the things that we've been racking our brains about is the relationship between the achievement index and these indicators. And ultimately, as we were talking about alignment and indicators that we think might be added, I for one believe that one statewide indicator should be, we should have a goal that all kids have access to good schools as determined by the index. And so we should be tracking, eventually our goal should be to migrate schools from the bottom tiers of the index to the top. And having that as a system indicator will make the alignment of the achievement index and these statewide indicators, I think, more clear. And let's go, I'm worried that we're going to so let's do one more and then we'll move on. The intent of the bill was to provide a snapshot of the educational system health and not a gotcha mechanism for districts or schools. I think that was, I'm agreeing with that. We do, we are a working group here, so let's bare our souls here. We do have a challenge. We do have a challenge in communicating the relationship of these indicators to the index. And I think we need some more work on that. I've tried to, when I give my speeches at various associations, and it is a difficult explanation, and I think we got to build some language around that and make that clear, because there is a natural inclination for people to believe, okay, well, if you're establishing these as the indicators, why, obviously you're going to disaggregate them at school level. So that's a real issue that I think we need to work on further. All right, so we're getting more comments, but maybe, Greg, you can advance the ball a few more slides, and then we'll look back.
Yeah, we're going to continue moving on, and I just seeing all of these comments come through and questions, many are statements as well. It's great to see the feedback coming in. As we look at the kind of current thing, and I'll reiterate this, we've talked about this a little bit, the initial thoughts on kind of setting goals around 5491 and the 6 very specific indicators that are defined in the bill as it sits now. It's important to remember that we have these significant changes underway, particularly with SBAC coming online for Common Core, measuring Common Core standards, state standards in 2014-15, and then WAKIDS, the increasingly representative sample between now and 2018. One of the other things that factored into our thinking around this also was the notion that the first cohort of students that will encounter Common Core state standards for the entirety of their K-12 educational career will be the class of 2027. So that'll be the kindergartners in the 2014-15 school year. So these kind of phases have been factored into our initial thinking. As we looked at, for the first round, for setting the goals for the indicators, the 2 overarching kind of guiding goal statements, one is to close the achievement gap within the PK-12 system, and then 2 is to really understand career and college readiness for all students and to close the gap there.
More than understanding, Greg.
We want to achieve it.
Yes, we want to achieve it. And so in looking at the implementation of this and also looking at other models that are underway, one of the initial drafts that we're kind of describing here is between now and 2020, reducing all gaps, so not only the all students but all of the subgroups, by 1/2 as we get to 2020. With the notion that we need to recalibrate the baselines for 4th grade reading and 8th grade math with the 2014-15 SBAC data when that comes out. And then a second phase, which is to move beyond kind of our vision for 2020 and to close the remaining gap. So from an implementation standpoint, and given the way the comments have been coming thus far, what I'd suggest we do is we'll take a look at how these guiding goal strategies play out with one specific indicator, and then we'll loop back for comments and other feedback. As we have noticed in the last couple minutes, essentially a pause in the comments that we're seeing coming from you all out on the webinar. The first example, one of the things I've been doing as I've been building the data set is wherever possible grabbing all of the historical, and just for simplicity on this slide, as we look at 4th grade reading, we're looking at the last 5 years of data, so 09 to 13 data. I'm proposing a baseline which is not purely the 2013 data, but which is actually an average of the 2012 and 13 data to mediate some of the volatility we see in very, very small environments, but really at the state level to look at taking 2012-13 as the baseline for this goal-setting work. I will note here that there's also on the right-hand column that you're currently seeing is a linear trend. That's the 5-year change per year. So in the case of all students for 4th grade reading, the 0.19 is the points change per year. So that indicator has been increasing at roughly 0.2% per year over the 5 years. You see the data which we currently have on the other subgroup indicators. And then overlaying within this, essentially the application of our goal strategy, which is to cut the gap in half. So in the second right-hand set of columns that appear, we see the gap to 100%. So for the all students group, the gap to 100% from the baseline, 27.6. What is half of that gap, and then what calculating the yearly step. So as this were to roll out visually, since I know some of you will see this better in a graph as opposed to a table, is for the first phase through 2020, we see this large reduction in the gaps as we apply these steps. One of the important aspects is that the step at the subgroup level is calculated based on that subgroup. So if there's a larger gap currently in 2012-13, the year-by-year step in setting these goals would be larger for that subgroup. And to extend this visual, basically it takes us out to closing the gap by 2027, so at 2026, closing the gap. And admittedly, this is a fairly straightforward application of the goal strategy to basically take this linear approach to closing the gap and to setting these goals. One of the reasons why I've taken a look at the 5-year trend of improvement for each of the groups is so that you do have the ability to say, okay, the trend is 1 percentage point per year change for the Asian subgroup, and the step that's required is 1.4. So the step that's required in this application of the goal strategy is not that far off of what we're currently seeing, but it is a little bit higher. So in the previous couple slides and in the detailed pre-read memo, we have the details around this that show kind of closing this, the strategy of closing the gap through 2027. I will reemphasize at this point, this notion that our approach here is phased, and it is based on particularly 2 significant milestones in terms of, with WA Kids, after we have 2 more years of data, so in the fall of 2015, recalibrating the baseline for WA Kids as we have an increasingly representative sample across the state, and at the same time, then we'll have our first statewide year of SBAC data for the Common Core assessments, and we'll need to recalibrate the baseline at that point as well. I'm going to leave this slide up here for a while as we enter into the conversation and the discussion, because this is essentially a snapshot of the application of this goal strategy to all 6 targets. Now, the current state of some of these goal targets, you'll see particularly on the last 2, on percent of graduates enrolled or employed 2nd and 4th quarter after graduation. Because of limitations on the current data set, I have broken that into 2 sub-indicators, the post-secondary education and the post-secondary employment, as essentially sub-indicators within that overall indicator. We understand from some feedback which has come in over the last 24 hours that the intent around this goal really was to look at students who are engaged or disengaged. We understand that there are some limitations currently in the sampling around that data. So I'll give you a second to process this.
Great. So as we're waiting for people to process and ask a question, let's start by addressing the money question. Okay. The chart that you have back there does indeed show the whole gap eliminated, right?
Correct.
But it's in 2027, right? And
Yep.
we might as well have this conversation now among us because we're going to have it publicly with the legislature and everything else, right? That's a long time. There's a lot of kids, right? And I'm saying this agreeing with you, so, this is not putting you on the spot, but we got to wrestle with this as a working group, right? And so what is the narrative, do you think, about the very first question that comes up? It's really going to be the very first question that comes up. How can you say that we're not going to close the gap by 2027? Now, that's not all your responsibility to answer, but as a discussion point, and then I'll add, maybe some other folks will add as well.
And I'll touch on some of my thinking and going on. And one of the things that I do is I spend typically at least 1, if not 2 days a week in the field, in the schools. Mm-hmm. And in interpreting and trying to apply realistic and challenging, as specified in 5491, with the reality of what we see, there are some areas of misalignment currently. Mm-hmm. I mean, certainly the ELL, the pure current ELL definition for the ELL subgroup, getting that group to 100% proficiency when they have not achieved English language proficiency, mm-hmm. and when we're testing them on an English language assessment, mm-hmm. or an assessment which is delivered in English, mm-hmm. it seems a misalignment. Mm-hmm. The other part in looking at, when we look at particularly the alignment between this and AMOs, mm-hmm. which uses a 2017 cut the gap in half endpoint, one of the reasons that I gravitated towards 2020 in some conversations that came up over the last month is because we now really understand the details of the change that's underway in our system, mm-hmm. and the change of every single student having new grade level standards with the implementation of Common Core and the assessments to measure that is a huge change to the system. Mm-hmm. So that's why I feel and I hope, I'd love to hear from practitioners that we need to be thinking about a realistic time frame in this. And that's kind of the perspective I took in this. And I think there are a lot of very good discussions, not only around the 5491 work, but around the other sets of educational indicators and accountability and alignment of those systems around things like looking at the former ELL subgroup as a critical subgroup to monitor. And several of the people that are on the call and have been adding quite a few comments in the chat window, we have just received a first pass at the 3-year view of the former ELL subgroup. Mm-hmm. So we'll be starting as part of the scenarios around the accountability index. We'll start to see what really is the impact of that former ELL subgroup as part of the alignment of these various systems.
And another thing we've discussed, but for the sake of the group here, that, we've talked about the fact that this bill was probably, I suppose there's varying opinions on this, but this bill was in part a tandem bill with funding McCleary, right? And if we do buy into the assumption that full funding, ample provision for schools is the resource that, and remember our guiding principle, right? That change takes time, but it also takes resource, right? And if we buy into the assumption that full funding of our public schools, which in theory is supposed to occur by 2018, if that is what is needed to close gaps, and I think that's a logical assumption to make, then you're talking about that being present for the first time in 2018, right?
Right.
In which case, then you think about a generation of students and how long it takes for those resources to actually take hold, to actually produce classroom-based changes. And so there is I guess the upshot of this comment is there is an alignment issue in terms of our resource commitment here. And if we make an assumption that we're going to achieve our grandest ambitions prior to that, well, then what was the resource for? Right? So, Maria, you had a comment.
So on what you're saying, Ben, yes, it takes resources, and we know that schools with the largest opportunity gaps often have less local levy money, all these things, or they have, and also less highly skilled teachers, so more out of subject teachers, all of these things. So, but on the other end, we have schools that are growing their kids faster, and with what some of the comments are about, is this realistic? Well, I think for the first time, because we have a pretty persistent and huge gap, if you go back 20 years or 50 years or 60 years, we keep setting these end goals. So in the next 10 years we'll get there, or the next 20 years, we still haven't gotten there. It's not narrowed. We're going to be able to show on the flip end with the index and the accountability system growth, SGPs. That's the thing where we can say, you will have to this year grow these kids an extra whatever, 0.4 or whatever it is. And by doing that, you will measurably close this gap. And that's the thing that's always been missing. And the schools that have been doing it very well, they're at that level of data. But this is the first time that as a state responsibility, we're providing it. So I think this is realistic, but I also think that we'll get there way before in many of our schools, 2027 or whatever, and that we'll be able to highlight those schools and say they did it before. And also, with the resources, schools that are doing it right now are reallocating what meager resources they have to support the things that close it. So that growth thing is like the biggest thing in moving the gap, not just a proficiency snapshot.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. And this is a issue near and dear to everyone's heart. In particular, communities of color are rightfully impatient, right? I mean, how many decades have we been talking about, okay, we're going to do something to close the achievement gap? But Greg, I think you've done a nice job of kind of like, rigorously thinking through what does realistic mean, but without compromising our ideals, and also in thinking through the relationship of our resource commitment to our targets. So kudos for that. Let's take some comments at this point. Go ahead, Greg.
I think as I looked at this, one of the things that these indicators being in front of the legislature in the report on December 1st will, while many of them have seen various forms of this data before, it will remind them on some of the critical issues, like the validity of looking at the ELL subgroup on an English-only assessment. So I think this will also help expose or kind of make more visible some of the issues which we're facing out in the field.
Sarah, maybe you can answer, are our ethnic commission representatives online with us? Lillian and Wanda and...
If you expand the attendees box, it should list the names.
Okay, I'd be particularly interested in hearing from them towards the end of the section. Greg, what do you think? I mean, you've been around the block a few times with these sorts of things. I wonder what your sense of the, there's a technical mind way of thinking about this, and then there's how a broader community would respond to it. What would your sense be as to how people would, kind of beyond the technical working group crowd, would respond to this?
I think one of the things that we'll want to understand is I can see scenarios if I were, say, in a work study with a school board, how some of these indicators and the specific goals that we've defined here would be interpreted as being either realistic or unrealistic. I think that's part of the side effect of any goal setting activity and then monitoring the results of those goals is that it stimulates conversations. And in stimulating the right conversations, I think that can be a very positive thing. But I think the communications on these is a huge challenge.
Let's take some comments here. Is there any particular order I should... Here's a comment. I think these goals are great, but without any type of system alignment amongst the other agencies, and then parenthetically it indicates legislature, governor, OSPI, Dell, et cetera, it's going to be increasingly difficult to get there. We need to seek adoption of these goals and milestones by all parties. I agree, and one of the things that we've been wrestling with is, just as we were ramping this up, goals, Results Washington came out. We were caught a bit unawares by that effort, and some of these goal areas touch on lots of agencies, and ultimately it is the legislature's job. I mean, I think that's why they created this bill. It is the legislature's job to direct traffic in terms of roles and responsibilities. And my hope is that in the production of this data version, we can drive this very issue of saying, okay, we've poured a fair amount of analytical work into this. We've sought a lot of feedback. We've wrestled with realistic versus ambitious. Legislature, we need you to use this to drive system alignment and to send a broader message that we need to be impatient, both from a resource standpoint and an achievement standpoint.
There's a couple comments here. One is, I like the thinking of proficiency being 40% of the index and student growth being 60%. This is truly reflective of a continuous improvement model.
Good.
I agree with Maria that a lot can be done within current resources, but we must develop more effective ways of spreading effective practices to all schools with higher need students.
Yeah, that's a serious comment. I've given some thought to that, and that's going to come up in the second webinar later today about, for example, we have a recognition system, right? And we recognize exemplary schools. What do we do with that? So what that it's great that we are generating, not to poo-poo how important it is to, recognize schools for high performance, because that is important. But part of our assumption here has to be that there's some best practices to harvest there, and that has to be part of our system. What else do we got here? Oops. I'm going to try to, some of these have been addressed already. Okay, bear with us as we kind of read here. A little bit more dead air before we... Yes, here's a good question. And we do have to wrestle with this. How do these proficiency targets jibe with our ESEA waiver submission, which is what we were talking about yesterday in terms of the cut gap in half to 2017 versus this, and what we, again, we're not going to be calling out the people who are asking these questions, but to the questioner, great question, and we are struggling analytically, I think, with this enormous, I'm struggling for the right language here, recalibration that we're about to undertake. You set those original ESEA targets based on from 2011 to 2017, right? Right. Based on the instruments that you have at the time, and we don't have any sense yet as to how the move to Common Core and Common Core assessments will upset that apple cart, as it were, in terms of how big that gap is after the fact, how far we are from the finish line, and so it's a good question. I don't know if there's a perfect answer to it. On the one hand, I don't feel obligated to exactly replicate what we put in that initial application. On the other hand, if we're not going to exactly replicate it, we better have a pretty darn good reason as to why.
And I think this also ties back with the alignment between what we would recommend as future kind of evolutionary steps of these indicators, the revised accountability index, which is also being submitted to the feds as part of the flexibility waiver revision.
Right. Okay, here's a comment. This is. I guess we should just deal with this. So the state should take this opportunity to revisit WAKIDS. Listen to the practitioners. Since there is no post-test with WAKIDS, the progress Greg mentioned as a goal is not measured. But no one in K-12 wants to post-test with WAKIDS. There needs to be a better assessment and one that can actually measure growth. A new assessment should align with Common Core. Yeah. Well, I'm hearing this from a number of people. We had this conversation at the State Board of Education meeting, and I'm hearing it from enough folks that we're not going to be able to just kind of ignore it. So I don't know. Maybe we should talk about something, a bill, or I don't know. I think we need knowledgeable people around the table on WAKIDS, and I'm probably not the right person to be talking about that. But this is a key stakeholder input piece. This is the fourth person that has mentioned this to me in one form or another. Do you have any comments, Maria or Deb?
Well, I think that we would want to have Kathy Taylor or Robin Musson here to discuss WAKIDS and sort of the look at it and how it aligns with Common Core and the different ways that they're thinking about how it assesses where we're starting. It assesses the starting point of whether or not there's a assessment done at the end of the kindergarten year, but then again, as Maria was saying earlier, looking at those students who sort of start off behind, what happens to them, and how do we look at those who are making great progress?
Sure. Is our WAKIDS or is our Dell representative logged on? Do we know?
Yes, I think so.
Okay. Maybe when we get to the open mic aspect, has that person indicated an interest in
I'm not
speaking?
seeing it
Okay.
in the chats, only
Okay.
inside.
All right.
Your chat box is over the attendee box, so if you moved it,
Yep.
you should be able to expand that and
Okay.
see who's registered
Got
or
it.
who's on.
Okay. All right. We're going to get through a couple more here. Okay. We might. Oh, goodness. Okay. Well, here's a powerful piece of feedback. Okay, and Greg, I see you spoke to this a little bit, but let's read it unvarnished. This proposal is more than a little ridiculous. Okay, I'm not laughing because I'm not taking it seriously. I'm just noting the charged language. Kids who do not speak English will not pass the test, so that subject will never reach 100%. Indeed, that's a good point. When will there be any realistic proposal about this subgroup? Someone has got to step up. Well, I kind of feel like I've been stepping up on the ELL. I think, Greg, you did talk about this a little bit, and it is part of the realistic aspect of realistic and ambitious. The state board is not done on this issue. There's just the board has a deep conviction about this, and they're not just going to go away lightly on this. So we might need to continue to work in the ELL subgroup and figure out if we need a policy position that just goes beyond the ever ELL cell and expands to, in what language we give the test and so forth.
And certainly, as part of realistic that hasn't been discussed here on the phone is the fact that the U.S. Department of Ed requires certain things from a compliance standpoint around reporting and what's required in things like the flexibility waiver. And there's that ELL subgroup has been absolutely required to be in all of those pieces for years. And so part of realistic is also hitting essentially those compliance aspects as well that unfortunately in some ways don't allow us to really take. It's only in the last couple months that there's been a willingness to take a deeper look at that issue of how do we accurately look at ELL performance.
Sure. And there's a comment that special ed needs to be seen in the same light, and many of the same challenges for that subgroup. Okay, just a couple more minutes as we make sure we've responded to all of your questions. Okay. There's some comments here about, one of our, and I suppose it could be somewhat controversial, but I think it's true that one of our guiding principles is that we could make incremental improvements within our existing resource, but we can't reach our real goals without additional resource. And I suppose there's some sensitivity in saying that, but it's what I believe. And I think the controversy of that statement runs both ways. If you go back to the legislature and say we can't make any more improvements without additional resource, there's a credibility gap there, I think. Okay. Oh, there's a concern about ignoring special ed students, so let's address that head on. Feels like special ed is being ignored here. It is not unlike ELL, is the comment. So let's parking lot that for just a second. I'm going to read 3 of these. Ben, the state piloted the kindergarten assessments. I've been told that those who piloted did not support WA Kids, but other assessments that were piloted, the state selected WA Kids in spite of those testers' input. Ben, we want to give you credit. You have taken the... Hey, let's make sure we read this one here. You have taken the ELL issue seriously and have stepped up, but we seem to be losing ground. Greg, yes, the feds are not addressing the issue. Ben, special ed and ELL are not the same. So we've got 2 or 3 comments about special ed and ELL. So I kind of agree that there's similarities but real differences in the special ed and ELL population, vis-a-vis the index and vis-a-vis system goals. So it seems to me that the language barrier issue in terms of part of our narrative on ELL has been the counterintuitiveness of testing students in a language they have yet to acquire. Doesn't cross apply to special education students, but one could argue that the issue about if you're a language learner, you're always a language learner from the standpoint of tracking progress and understanding needs may also be true for special ed as well, in terms of if you are a special education student, just because you have exited doesn't mean that your needs are not unique in a way and should be tracked. What are your thoughts on that question, Greg?
And I'm sure other people around the table will have some opinions here, but I think one of the things I often hear out in the field is the inconsistent between state and federal requirements around this is a cause of significant frustration.
On special ed?
On special ed specifically. That an IEP team can get together and in defining the right IEP for a special needs student, say that this student is proficient at level 2, what we've always used to call the WABA level or WASL basic level. But the feds don't allow that to be reported for federal accountability. So a building can be doing the right things in the IEP and getting those students to the defined proficiency in the IEP, but then they don't get credit for that as that data rolls up into federal accountability. So that I know that misalignment has been a subject of some confusion.
Maria has some thoughts.
Well, I'd also add, so Greg, in our shop with schools that have been identified for students with disabilities, their subgroup, we'll disaggregate it by the qualifying disability. So not just every single IEP is different based on the student, and there's a different look that happens. So I would push back on the comment that kids who are identified in SPED will always be SPED, because it really depends on their qualifying disability.
Sure,
now,
least restricted.
Right, and so like a more developmentally disabled student might have a different experience and different outcome measures that we would see in the system versus a student who's in there for speech or a specific reading learning disability that they get what they need and overcome and are pretty much exited completely and very successful. So I would want to always hold that. I don't know, I think we can do it at a state level as a snapshot, but it would be fascinating to look at if you took that one out and distributed it across all the qualifying codes. There's like 12, right, at the high level. What would we see? And
Yeah, I think Maria raises a good point, which is one of the challenges we face with some of at the building and district level is often when you disaggregate special needs across the categorical codes, the numbers are very small. But yes, one of the benefits is to essentially take that second step around looking more deeply at the special ed, at the students with disabilities data.
And this, this project of setting goals, as we're seeing we're kicking up a lot of dust along the way in a positive way, that it identifies a lot of policy issues that need to be addressed, just separate and apart from the actual goals themselves. And I think that that's got to be seen as a positive byproduct of all this. And if we can make incremental progress on some of these things, that's good. That can become part of why you set goals. I agree. Similarities and real differences. The similarity. So this is in relationship to the special ed versus ELL issue. The similarity I'm referencing is that they don't qualify for being counted in the subgroup once they don't qualify. Right? Once they exit, they're no longer. From the standpoint of indexing a school, it isn't fair to continuously hold a hostage in the index those schools with a high population of SE students. Right? I understand that point. Okay. Do we think that we got to all the comments, Greg? I tried to whip through as best I could. I tried to consult. If I got the same comment 3 times, I tried to kind of read it as one. But.
Yeah, I think we got to the very, very vast majority that weren't super specific. There were a couple, as we look at the chat log later on, where there are some very, very kind of specific questions around a given kind of indicator and year and data point and such, and I think we'll respond to those as well in the kind of post-analysis of the webinar.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I see that our Dell representative has logged on, and I don't. Did anybody email in wishing to speak on the open mic at the end?
Right, so just as a reminder, we're getting close to the open mic time, and if you'd like to speak on the conference call, please type in the chat question window, please call on me.
Yeah, and I haven't seen any please call on me's yet. I also believe that Kathy Taylor might be able to join us here at the tail end. We're actually doing pretty well on time, and so we'll give a few more minutes for people to indicate whether they want to speak. Please call on me. Okay, there's one. All right. So let's just go. Our agenda's till 11:30, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So let's go ahead with the one who's indicated they want to speak. Now, let me just emphasize that we're doing this against our better judgment because. Really, one person does need to speak, otherwise it gets very chaotic. So we're going to unmute this, and then if we could have Carrie Wolf from Dell. Hold on just a sec, Carrie.
All guests have been unmuted. You will now rejoin the meeting.
Carrie, are you able to speak to us?
Hello, this is Carrie Wolf.
Hi, Carrie. So
Hello.
We're going to give you the floor, and everybody else is not going to interrupt. And if you could, obviously there was some pretty robust discussion about WA Kids, and without posing you a specific question, just wondered if you had any reflections.
Yeah, I absolutely, and I appreciate the opportunity. Just to introduce myself a little bit, I'm the new data governance coordinator here at Dell, and I'm relatively new to Dell, and I'm new to this process on this work group, but I do appreciate the the discussion around WA Kids. It is a whole child assessment that we feel is important. It's an assessment we do in our state pre-K, and I understand though the concern about needing to align with Common Core. And I will discuss this internally here with our folks, and we'll try to get some feedback to you post this webinar. Is that?
Yeah, that's fine, Carrie. And I just, aside from the conversation that we've had today, we had a retreat at our State Board of Education meeting about a month ago, and during our retreat portion, I was showing some data, and man, there was 3 or 4 state board members that were just on me about this. Real concerns about reliability, real concerns about, like, how do we use this information? Like, what's the responsible way to use it, etc. Kathy Taylor from OSPI has also joined us, and again, let me remind everybody we're on open mic, so please don't interject. And Kathy, I don't know, you caught off a little off guard here, you're coming in, but do you have, I understand Deb has kind of told you where the conversation's been going here. Do you have any thoughts to offer?
Well, you're right, I don't have all the context here, but I think we have done quite a bit to increase the reliability of the tool by requiring this year that teachers complete the Inter-Rater reliability certification, so that statewide is increasing the consistency of the data, and we will continue to do that. We also are working with teachers on how to use this data. In this past year, we have aligned it with the Common Core state standards as well as all other state learning standards. That was thanks to our teaching and learning team here at OSPI has done that work. So we have tried to be cognizant of the issues both about the use of the data as well as the alignment with state learning standards, and I think we have addressed both. Because the tool is used only at the beginning of the year, the way we talk about it with teachers is that we're trying to help teachers understand where children are beginning so that they can help them get to where they need to be at the end of the year in order to make progress not only on the Common Core state standards but on all learning standards. Some districts are volunteering to use the tool more than once during the year so that they can document progress. That is something that the state has contracted with teaching strategies to enable, but it is entirely up to the discretion of the district as to whether they choose to do that. So we're approaching the issues in the use of the data and its alignment with state learning standards from many different perspectives. And I think moving this forward, we're in a much different place than we were a couple years ago with this.
Okay, that's helpful. That was information I didn't know about the Inter-Rater reliability survey. Okay, we have another question?
We have one more.
Okay, go ahead and read it, Linda, if you would.
Did I hear, or am I assuming that the current set of indicators will be situated within a continuum of indicators data collection related to each specific indicator?
Where do we go with that, Greg? Do you understand what that means?
I'm guessing a little bit as to the actual interpretation of that, and we'll follow up with the individual specifically. But I think, as both Ben and I have mentioned, we are looking at and anticipating where the indicators need to evolve to, that it's not purely about percent meeting standard, and specifically looking at growth as one example of that, but also the alignment with the other kind of frameworks which are under development across the state as well. So I think this will be cast and set within the larger framework. And as we mentioned at the very beginning, this initial view of 6 indicators really is step 1, or kind of the beta test version.
Okay. All right. Well, there are some issues here for us to follow up on. So we will be taking all of the comments that have been offered and try to, Parker will work his wizardry in formulating a report to this effect. But clearly there are some issues surfacing here that we're going to have to wrestle with. Some of them may not have solutions with a capital S, but we're going to have to wrestle with them. Are there any other comments from members within the room for the good of the order? Okay, great. Those are all the comments that have been offered by our webinar, and we are ending exactly on time. So I hope that was a useful use of your time. I want to say that we are recording this webinar, and we are going to post it on our website, correct, Sarah?
Yes.
And so maybe when we get that all set up, we can email the link to folks. So people who are not able to participate today can go on and watch it at their leisure. Great webinar, very useful. Thanks for doing this option. Yes, it was very helpful. Thank you very much. Okay, good. Glad to hear it. Our dry run was not for naught. So thank you, everybody. And for those of you that are going to participate in the afternoon, we will see you then. And also, for those of you that feel like your issue just wasn't really, fleshed out like you felt like you wanted it to be, given the format, I have offered to create a smaller conference call with people if that is their desire. I'm not going to do it, obviously, if people, I'm not going to set something up unprovoked, but if people email me and say they want to have a chat, I am open to doing that as well. Thank you for your time, everybody, and we'll see some of you at, is it 1 o'clock? Did you were going to say something?
Oh, there was a question about whether we could get the slides, and yes, we will post the PowerPoints as well.
Okay, very good. Thank you, everyone.